I'll never forget that night. Not because of the usual chaos that comes with the job, but because of what happened after I picked up that call. I'm Detective Mike Harrison, a seasoned officer with the Phoenix Police Department. You've probably heard the stories about the things cops see when the sun goes down. But there are some things you just can't unsee. And if you'd been in my shoes that night, you'd still be haunted by it, just like I am. It was late, almost 2 a.m., and I had just wrapped up a routine investigation in the south part of the city. It was quiet, too quiet, and I had a bad feeling in my gut. The kind of feeling you get when you know something isn't right, but you can't put your finger on it. I was heading back to the precinct when my radio crackled. Unit 12, come in. We've got a 911 call at the old warehouse on 5th and Oak. No details, but it sounds urgent. Possible break-in or worse. I paused for a second, then hit the lights and sirens, speeding toward the location. 5th and Oak? That place had been abandoned for years. It was known for squatters and the occasional homeless person looking for shelter, but nothing serious had ever gone down there. Still, my instincts told me to be cautious. When I got there, the place was eerily quiet. Not a single sign of life. I got out of the car and approached cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the dark. The warehouse loomed like a giant shadow, silent and looming in the cold night air. As I got closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a door slightly ajar, and a faint light flickered from within. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cutting through the silence. There was no response. I radioed for backup, but there was no answer. It was just me, in the dead of night, standing at the entrance of a place I shouldn't have been. I stepped inside, and immediately, the air felt wrong. It was thick, stale, like something had been festering in there for years. The floor creaked under my boots as I moved further in, trying to shake the unease gnawing at my gut. Then I saw it, a shape moving in the darkness, just beyond the flickering light. It wasn't human, at least not in any way I'd ever seen. The figure was hunched, its limbs twisted at odd angles. I froze, heart pounding in my chest, wondering if I had just stepped into some kind of nightmare. "Who's there?" I shouted, voice steady but shaking from the adrenaline rushing through me. The figure stopped, and then slowly, deliberately, it turned toward me. In the dim light, I could just make out its face or what was left of it. The skin was pale and stretched too tight over its skull. Its eyes, black as coal, locked onto mine with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. It didn't speak, but I could feel it. It was waiting for me to make the next move. And I realized, too late, that I had made a grave mistake by entering alone. My hand hovered over my gun, but I didn't pull it out. Something told me this wasn't the kind of situation where a weapon would do any good. The figure, if you could even call it that, kept its gaze fixed on me, not blinking once. There was a heavy silence in the room, the kind that seemed to drag on forever, suffocating me with its weight. I should have backed out, but I didn't. I was trained for situations like this. I was supposed to be the one who stayed calm, who took control. So I took a step forward, my flashlight shaking in my grip. "Are you all right?" I called out, my voice sounding weak in the cavernous space. It didn't respond. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as if considering me. The air grew colder, and I could feel my breath freezing in my lungs. I took another step forward, and that's when I heard it, the softest sound, almost like a whisper, coming from the figure's lips. "Help!" I froze. The word was so faint, so broken, but it was there. I couldn't tell if it was a plea for help or some twisted mockery. Everything inside me screamed to turn and run, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. It was like something was pulling me in, drawing me closer to it. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice firmer this time. But even as the words left my mouth, I regretted them. It was as if I had just invited whatever this thing was to make its next move. The figure took a slow, deliberate step toward me. My heart raced. Without warning, the light from my flashlight flickered, then died completely. I cursed under my breath, fumbling to turn it back on, but it was no use. Everything around me plunged into darkness, and I was left in the pitch-black room with it. I could hear it now, moving around me, The sound of its feet scraping against the concrete floor, the soft rustle of something like fabric brushing against the air. I swung my hand around, but I couldn't find it, and then I felt it. Cold, clammy fingers wrap around my wrist, yanking me toward the darkness. The grip was like ice, and the sensation sent a shock of panic through me. "Get off!" I shouted, struggling against it, but it was too strong. My mind raced, trying to recall every possible strategy, every move I'd ever learned to get out of situations like this. But nothing could prepare me for the suffocating, unnatural strength that this thing had. I was dragged deeper into the shadows, my heart hammering in my chest. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. Then, in that instant, I realized something that made my blood run even colder. There was more than just this one thing. There were others, moving silently in the darkness around me. I could hear their soft, shuffling steps, their breathless, guttural whispers. And I was alone. I couldn't move. My mind screamed for me to fight, to get out, but my body was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The grip on my wrist was like iron, pulling me further into the pitch-black shadows. The air was thick, suffocating. My lungs burned as I gasped for breath, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure in front of me. I don't know how I knew it, but I realized with a chilling certainty that these things weren't alive. Not in any sense of the word. They were dead or something close to it. I could feel it in the coldness of their touch, in the unnatural way they moved. The figure that had grabbed me didn't speak, but I heard a noise, something like a whisper in my ear. It wasn't words. It was more like the sound of teeth grinding together, a rasping sound that made my skin crawl. My stomach turned, bile rising in my throat. I tugged again, trying to free myself, but it was no use. The grip tightened, pulling me further into the darkness, deeper into the warehouse. I stumbled, nearly falling, but the thing didn't let go. It dragged me along like I weighed nothing. And then, in the distance, I saw something. It was faint at first, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw a glow, a pale blue light, flickering like a dying flame. It was coming from what looked like an old furnace room, one that I hadn't even noticed when I first entered the warehouse. But now it was all I could see. The thing holding me let out a low, rasping sound, like it was excited. My heart pounded in my chest. I had no choice but to follow, to move toward that eerie light, though every part of me screamed to run in the other direction. As we got closer, I saw the source of the light. A small, flickering lamp sitting on an old, rusted table, and surrounding it, bodies. Dead bodies, piled on top of each other like they had been thrown together without care. Some of them were half decomposed, their skin hanging loosely from their bones, their eyes wide open, staring lifelessly into the void. But there was something worse than the bodies. Their mouths were open, frozen in grotesque, silent screams. And then, as I stood there, paralyzed by the sight, I realized they weren't dead. Not entirely. Their eyes twitched, just slightly, and their bodies shuddered. It was as if they were waiting for something to happen. I tried to back away, but the thing holding me yanked me forward again, its grip tightening painfully. A cold laugh echoed through the room, a high-pitched, unnatural sound that sent a spike of terror through me. "Welcome to your end," the voice rasped. I turned my head, but the figure behind me wasn't speaking. It wasn't the figure at all. It was one of the bodies. One of the corpses had spoken. Its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, like it was forcing the words out from deep inside its throat. I didn't want to believe it, but I saw it with my own eyes. "Help us," the corpse continued, its voice a wet, choking whisper. "Help us escape." Couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My mind screamed for me to run, but there was nowhere to go. These things were everywhere now, closing in on me from all sides. They were dead, but somehow they were still aware, still alive in some twisted way. And then the realization hit me. This wasn't just a place. It wasn't just a warehouse. It was a trap. A place where souls were kept, trapped in bodies that were never meant to move again. I was standing in the middle of a graveyard where the dead didn't rest. And I was next. I needed to get out. I needed to fight to survive. But as I looked around, I knew something even worse. The door was gone. The way out, it had vanished. I was trapped. Panic surged through me, a wave of cold terror that threatened to swallow me whole. I stumbled backward, my back slamming against the wall, as the dead continued to shuffle toward me. Their bodies were stiff, their faces grotesque with the remnants of death, but their eyes, those eyes, followed my every movement, every breath I took, every heartbeat that raced in my chest. It was then that I realized the full horror of this place. This wasn't just a warehouse. It was a prison where the souls of the lost, the tortured, and the forsaken were trapped. Their bodies nothing more than vessels, puppets under the control of something far worse than any human mind could comprehend. Help us. The voice of the corpse echoed again, its eyes glistening with a hunger that wasn't entirely human. I shook my head, desperate, trying to tear my eyes away from the sight of them. I couldn't let them get closer. I couldn't let them drag me into their madness. There was a distant sound, a low hum, coming from somewhere deep within the warehouse. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I listened more closely, I realized it wasn't the wind. It was the hum of machinery, the sound of something far more sinister, something that seemed to vibrate deep in my bones. I had to find it. I had to find the source of the noise. It was the only chance I had left. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. I couldn't stand here like a helpless animal waiting to be devoured. I had to move, I had to do something. The dead continued to whisper, their voices now a chorus of desperation and madness. Help us. Save us. Their eyes were fixed on me, and I could feel their hunger, their need for release. But I wasn't their salvation. I wasn't here to free them. I was here to survive. I turned and ran, pushing through the darkened warehouse, my heart hammering in my chest. I could hear the shuffle of feet behind me, the soft, dragging steps of the dead following my every move. Their breathing was ragged, like they were choking on the air, their voices growing louder, more frantic. Save us? I pushed harder, my legs burning as I sprinted down the dimly lit hallway, searching for anything that could give me an escape. But every door I passed was locked. Every window was boarded up, sealing me inside this nightmare. The hum of the machinery grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from somewhere ahead, a light glowing faintly in the distance. I didn't know what it was, but it felt like my last hope. I rounded a corner and came face to face with a massive door, rusty and old, but slightly ajar. The faint blue light spilled out from the crack in the door, casting strange shadows along the floor. Without thinking, I shoved the door open and stepped inside. What I saw made my stomach churn. It was a control room of sorts, filled with old computers and machines, wires running like veins across the walls. But that wasn't what caught my attention. What I saw in the center of the room, strapped to a chair, was even worse. A man, or what had once been a man. He was strapped in tightly, his face twisted in agony, his eyes wide open, pleading with something I couldn't see. His skin was pale, stretched tight over his skull, but there was something wrong with his eyes. They weren't human anymore. They were filled with a dark, empty void, staring at nothing. And then, as I stepped closer, I saw what I had missed. The wires connected to his temples, running into the machines that surrounded him. It was like they were feeding on him, draining his life force, his soul. Help? Please. The voice was faint, a whisper of a man long past his prime. I froze. This was it. This was the source of the horrors, the thing that had brought these dead, soulless beings back to life. But just as I was about to step forward, something shifted behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. The door had slammed shut, and the room was now bathed in a sickly, pulsating light. The bodies, the dead, were closing in. They had followed me in here. And that's when I realized, with a sickening certainty, that I wasn't alone in this nightmare. I was part of it. The machines, the bodies, they were all connected, and there was no way out. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me, each second stretching into an eternity as I realized the truth. The machines weren't just keeping the dead alive, they were feeding on them, using them, and worse, they were pulling me into the same fate. The figure strapped to the chair, whatever was left of him, stirred slightly, his eyes twitching. A deep groan escaped his throat, a sound so twisted it made my blood run cold. It wasn't human anymore. It was an empty shell, a puppet controlled by forces beyond comprehension. I turned to run, but the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening crash, locking me inside. I felt the cold steel pressing against my back, as though the building itself was alive, suffocating me. Panic surged, and I slammed my fist against the door, but it didn't budge. From the corners of the room, the bodies in the shadows started to move. They weren't shuffling anymore. They were walking, slowly but with purpose, their eyes locked on me. The whispering voices from the dark, the sickly hum of the machines, everything around me was closing in. I backed away toward the center of the room, my mind racing for a plan, for some way out. But I knew, deep down, that I wasn't going to find one. The machines, the wires, the lights, they weren't just trapping me physically. They were binding me to this place, to this nightmare. The room felt smaller now, like the walls were closing in, tightening around me. The whispering grew louder, almost unbearable, until I could barely think straight. It was as if the voices were crawling inside my mind, their words twisting and contorting into something sinister. "Join us?" came the rasping voice, the one from the dead bodies. It wasn't a plea anymore. It was a command, an order. "Become one of us?" I spun around, my mind trying to make sense of the madness. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to stop this. My gaze fell on the man in the chair again. His eyes were wide open, vacant but somehow knowing. His mouth moved, but this time the words were clear. "Don't look at them." His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "Run, before it's too late." I stumbled back, my legs buckling under the weight of his words. My heart pounded in my chest as the dead moved closer, their slow, deliberate steps closing the gap between us. But it was too late. They were all around me now, surrounding me. I could feel the chill of their presence, the cold hands brushing against my skin, the faintest breath on the back of my neck. The whispering was deafening, overwhelming, as if the very air itself was thick with their suffering. And then the machine hummed louder. I turned, eyes wide with horror, to see the wires beginning to pulse, glowing with an eerie blue light. The machines whirred to life, their screens flashing with strange, incomprehensible symbols. A voice, deep and guttural, echoed from the machines. It wasn't a voice I had ever heard before, but somehow it resonated with a power that made my blood freeze. "Your soul is ours." I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. The walls of the room seemed to close in tighter, and I felt an unnatural pressure building around my chest, squeezing the life out of me. One of the dead stepped forward. Its eyes were wide open, staring into mine. There was something in its gaze, something familiar, something that made my blood run cold with realization. This wasn't just a place of death. It was a place of transformation. The souls of the dead were trapped here, bound by the machines, forced to live on, twisted and contorted into something else. And now it was my turn. The figure reached out, its hand cold and clammy, and before I could move, it grabbed me, pulling me toward the center of the room. I struggled, but its grip was like ice, its fingers digging into my skin. "Help us?" it whispered, its voice hollow, its face twisted in agony. "You can't escape." I wanted to scream, to fight, but the room was spinning. The machines hummed louder, their lights flashing violently, and the wires tightened around me, attaching themselves to my skin like they were alive, pulling me in. And then, just as the darkness began to overtake me, I saw a flicker of light, just a brief moment, a tiny crack in the abyss. It was my flashlight, still lying on the ground near the door, its light faint but still there. I had one last chance. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I yanked myself free from the dead's grip, pushing them aside, and stumbled toward the light, toward the only thing that could save me. I grabbed the flashlight and held it in front of me, the beam cutting through the shadows. The dead stopped in their tracks, as if the light held power over them. Their eyes flickered in the light, the twisted expressions on their faces faltering for just a moment. That was all I needed. I bolted for the door, my breath ragged, my heart in my throat. As I pushed through the darkness, the dead closing in behind me. And then, nothing. The next thing I remember, I was outside, gasping for air, my hands trembling as I leaned against the side of my car. I don't know how I escaped or what happened to the warehouse, but I know one thing for sure. That place is still there, and it's waiting for its next victim. I don't know who they were. I don't know why they're trapped in that hellhole, but I can never go back, because if I do, I might not be the one who walks out, and neither will you. I thought I had escaped. The cold air outside, the hum of the city in the distance, everything felt real again, like I had snapped back from a nightmare. But deep down, I knew better. What I had seen in that warehouse, the horror I'd experienced, it wasn't over. Couldn't be. I sat in my car, hands still shaking, trying to calm myself. I needed to make sense of what had happened. It felt like my mind was fractured, each piece pulling in a different direction. But one thought stuck in my head. The dead don't just die. They wait. I had heard those whispers in the dark, the desperate cries of the souls trapped inside those bodies. They were more than just spirits. They were hungry. They were being used, torn apart by whatever was controlling them, and they wanted something. Something from me. The hum of the machines, the pulse of the wires, the constant whispering. It was like they had left a mark on me, a part of them that now lived inside me. It wasn't just the fear that followed me. It was something worse, a connection. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how close I came to becoming one of them. To becoming a mindless puppet, trapped forever in that hellish cycle. I tried to shake it off. I had survived, right? But the unease gnawed at me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces. Those twisted, dead eyes, staring at me from the shadows. Their voices whispering in my ears, reminding me that I wasn't safe. I thought I could go back to my life. But the calls, the strange occurrences, they didn't stop. I started to hear things. Soft whispers in the dead of night, scratching at my door. The dead, calling to me from the darkness. And sometimes, I'd find myself in places I didn't recognize, places that felt wrong, like I was being pulled toward something I couldn't understand, something that wanted me to come back to that warehouse, to that room. And then it happened. I started seeing the faces. I was at work one day, just sitting at my desk, trying to put all of this behind me. But there they were, those dead eyes, staring at me from the shadows. I turned around, but no one was there. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog, but it was no use. I thought I was losing my mind. But then the phone rang. It was a call I couldn't ignore. The dispatcher's voice was frantic. Her words rushed. "Detective Harrison, we've got another 911 call. It's from the same warehouse, the same place. Someone else is inside." I froze. The dead weren't done with me. They never were. I grabbed my gun, my hands trembling as I tried to steady myself. It was too late to back out now. I had to go. I had to end this. For good. I arrived at the warehouse, heart pounding in my chest. The place was just as I remembered. Quiet, empty, like it had been waiting for me. The door was slightly ajar, just like before. But this time, I wasn't going in alone. I called for backup, and this time the others were with me. We moved in together, cautiously, carefully, our flashlights cutting through the shadows. But the silence, the stillness, it was wrong. It felt like the walls themselves were watching us, waiting for us to make the wrong move. We reached the room where it all began. The control room, the machines, the bodies. But when we stepped inside, we found something else entirely. The room was empty. The bodies were gone. The machines were off, dead, silent. And yet I felt it, that cold, suffocating presence in the air. The machines weren't gone. They were waiting for the next soul to come. As we searched the area, I noticed something strange. There were fresh marks on the walls, like scratches, deep gouges where something had been dragged across the floor. And then I saw it, a small, flickering light coming from behind a pile of old debris. I moved closer, my heart pounding in my chest. As I pulled back the debris, I saw a face. It was the face of one of the dead. The same twisted, vacant expression, the same wide, unblinking eyes. But this time, it wasn't just a body. It was alive. The thing was alive again, crawling toward me, its hands stretched out, reaching for me. And just before I pulled the trigger, the whisper came again, louder than ever. "You can't escape. You're already one of us." I fired. The thing crumpled to the ground, but it didn't die. It just stopped. And as the others rushed in, I realized something I should have known from the start. The warehouse wasn't just a place. It was a door to something darker, something more ancient than any of us could comprehend. And once you stepped through it, once you became part of it, you could never leave. The dead weren't waiting for me to die. They were waiting for me to join them. And now I'm one of them. So when you hear the whispers in the dark, when you see the flickering light in the distance, remember this: you might think you're safe, but the dead are always watching. And one day they'll call your name, and then it's already too late. Did you like these stories? Write in the comments. And please write what you didn't like. It will be useful for me to know your opinion. And I will improve my work. Thank you. Subscribe to my channel and click the bell so as not to miss new stories. I try for you.